The Jordan Valley exhibits, to this day, one of the most violent geological scars on our planet, torn into the earth nearly 4 millennia ago. For centuries, academic circles tried to downgrade the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah to a mere folk tale. The famous rain of fire and brimstone was, in the minds of the most skeptical, just an exaggerated metaphor to scare the disobedient. The major problem with that thesis is that the earth does not lie. Recent forensic excavations at the Tal El Hammam site have brought to the surface a layer of destruction that mocks any traditional explanation. What scientists hold in their hands right now is pottery melted at thousands of degrees, boiled mortar, and soil that suffered instant chemical sterilization. The damage was not the work of a simple military fire started by torches. An earthquake does not boil the earth like this. What happened on those plains produced a thermal signature so brutal that for a few seconds it was literally hotter than the surface of the sun. There is an archaeological crime scene hidden beneath the desert ashes, and the material remains of what actually vaporized the richest region of the ancient world challenge everything common sense thought it knew about the physics of the judgment described in the book of Genesis. The account we find in the book of Genesis describes the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah with a precision that, until very recently, went completely unnoticed by modern science. The text is surgical in recording the direction of the event. The judgment did not spring from the ground, it plummeted from the sky. A relentless storm of brimstone and fire tore through the atmosphere, transforming a valley that Scripture itself compared to the garden of the Lord into a barren, calcined, and permanently toxic wasteland. And here, we need to take a step back and adjust our lenses. For many decades, we have been conditioned to visualize this biblical episode through almost childish illustrations or shallow interpretations. It is very common for people to imagine a small camp of tents catching fire because an invading army threw some torches, or perhaps a local fire that got a little out of control. But let's be frank, that is an amateur and myopic view of a local extinction event. The anatomy of what actually hit the Jordan Valley does not support simplistic theories. It demands a true forensic autopsy of the soil. When we look at the Dead Sea Basin today, we see only a desolate vastness of salt and cracked earth. But the archaeological strata tell us the story of a wildly rich commercial hub, a kind of Bronze Age metropolis that pulsed with life and housed tens of thousands of inhabitants. For an entire ecosystem, with its kings, armies, flocks, and colossal buildings, to be wiped from history overnight, the force employed had to be of a terrifying scale. What kind of physical phenomenon has the power to turn off life in an entire region in a matter of seconds? The answer to that question lay dormant under meters of sand and millennial dust. To understand the weight of this destruction, we are going to descend into the destruction matrix, the layer of ash and rubble isolated by archaeologists that acts as the black box of that day. We will decode the chemical anomalies in the soil that defy normal geology, investigate the shock physics that pulverized solid mud bricks, and understand the exact mechanics of how tens of thousands of people were wiped off the map in a single, blinding flash on the horizon. We are not dealing with a mere cautionary folktale. We are facing a real, physical cataclysm, documented by the stones themselves. The judgment that erased those cities left a trail embedded in the earth that millennia of wind have not managed to blow away. And it is exactly this structural signature that we are going to dissect from now on. But before we descend to these precious ruins, do your part in this journey of discovery. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next revelations. Leave a like if you value history taken seriously, and in the comments below, register your faith by writing Amen or leaving your favorite prayer. Your participation is what keeps this work standing. When modern archaeology decides to comb through the ruins of the Jordan Valley, what it finds in the layer corresponding to the Bronze Age is not the remnant of a common ancient war. It is a brutal and undeniable anomaly. When excavating the archaeological site of Tal el-Hammam, the experts' main bet for the exact location of biblical Sodom, researchers descended to a stratum formerly dubbed the Destruction Matrix. It is a dark band, about 4.5 feet deep, absolutely packed with ash, charred wood, crushed bricks, and shattered bones. Up to that point, a skeptic on duty might argue that this was merely the result of a massive invasion. But the Earth kept a secret under the dust, something that would make the math completely fail the simple enemy attack thesis. Hidden amidst this mash of millennial rubble, the multidisciplinary team of archaeologists and geologists stumbled upon the material proof of an impossible feat. We are talking about shards of everyday pottery, water jugs, plates, storage bowls, that were not merely blackened by the soot of flames. The outer surface of these objects had melted and turned into a greenish glass. This is what forensic science calls vitrification. And the documentary bazaar didn't stop there. Analyzing the samples under the precision of electron microscopes, laboratories discovered that the mortar holding the walls together was melted like caramel syrup, and extremely hard minerals featured internal bubbles. They literally boiled and foamed before cooling and hardening again. To understand the absolute gravity of what this discovery means, we need to put the numbers on the table and analyze the limitations of that era. If an invading army, like the Assyrians or Egyptians, decided to wipe a metropolis off the map in the Bronze Age, they would use the available weapons: torches, flaming arrows, and heavy wood fires. The catch is that a large-scale urban fire, even fueled by strong winds, reaches a maximum mark of 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. To give you a clear idea of this thermal limitation, the most powerful kilns that master craftsmen had for baking their clay pots barely exceeded that temperature. It was the absolute limit of the ancient world. The main issue is that 1,000 degrees isn't even close to liquefying rocks and minerals like zircon and quartz. Quartz, for example, only begins to melt at 3,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Zircon demands even more extreme temperatures. For the defensive walls of an entire city to start bubbling and turning into glass, thermodynamics is categorical. The region had to be bombarded by an instant thermal radiation of between 3,600 and 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is precisely where armchair skepticism falls apart. There was no primitive technology capable of generating such a hell on Earth. A temperature of that magnitude does not belong in the arsenal of any emperor in ancient history. In the modern world, however, scientists are very familiar with the kind of material that was unearthed. It even has a name: trinitite. It is exactly the same radioactive glass that lined the floor of the New Mexico desert in 1945, created in the fraction of a second when the first atomic bomb in history was detonated. The epicenter of modern nuclear tests is one of the very few environments on the planet where we find the same pattern of thermal destruction that was burned into the soil of Sodom. We have, therefore, undeniable physical evidence pointing to an absurdly extreme and instantaneous heat event. If the mortar boiled in that very second, what happened to those walking through those squares? The answer is harsh and direct. The vast majority of the population in those cities did not burn to death. The people were vaporized before their central nervous systems could even send a pain signal to their brains. When the book of Genesis records, word for word, that the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, the language might sound poetic to unsuspecting ears, but the result, driven into the ground, reveals a chemical and surgical violence. That area experienced a lethal flash. This thermal signature, the desert glass, is the final nail in the coffin of doubt. But the incalculable heat was only the symptom, the tip of the geological iceberg. If no human army, no matter how wicked, caused this collapse, what was the mechanics capable of making a sea of fire literally plunge from the clouds? The answer to that question is exactly where the ancient text and astrophysics enter into a total head-on collision. The book of Genesis, in chapter 19, verse 24, is crystal clear in its description. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. For generations, the skeptical intelligentsia turned their noses up at this passage. The argument always hit the same note. Fire doesn't fall from the sky on its own. To them, the biblical author was using exaggerated poetic license for a moral tale or reporting a volcanic eruption. The problem with this lazy thesis is that the geography doesn't add up. There isn't, and there has never been, a single volcano in that area of the Jordan Valley. The Earth simply does not corroborate the skeptical argument. It took forensic science and archaeology giving in and admitting that the text described a terrifyingly real physical phenomenon. To understand how a literal rain of fire plummets onto a city, we need to align modern geology with astrophysics. The answer goes by a technical name, the cosmic airburst. Just remember the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, when a detonation in the sky flattened 80 million trees in seconds without leaving a crater. What happened in the Jordan Valley operated under the exact same mechanics, only on an absurdly more terrifying scale, right on top of one of the greatest commercial hubs of antiquity. Let's reconstruct the climax of this destruction as if in slow motion, so you can visualize the magnitude of the tragedy. Forget conventional earthquakes or accidental fires. We are talking about planetary physics in its most unforgiving form. Imagine a massive fragment of space rock, an asteroid, or the core of a comet, dozens of yards in diameter, tearing through the vacuum and plunging into our atmosphere at nearly 40,000 miles per hour. The friction with the air is of an indescribable violence. The frontal pressure builds up unsustainably. This rock does not hit the ground. The structural and thermal stress is so absurd that it collapses a few miles high, resulting in a detonation equivalent to 1,000 atomic bombs. The mechanics of the event operated faster than the neurological capacity to process pain. In the exact instant of the explosion, the space rock converted into a colossal fireball. The flash generated was so brutal that it instantly blinded any inhabitant looking up. Since light travels much faster than sound, The first thing to punish the streets, fractions of a second later, was the pulse of thermal radiation, an insane wave of heat, reaching 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, descended vertically, swallowing everything. It was this thermal photograph that boiled the mortar of the buildings, melted the bricks in the blink of an eye, and vitrified the pottery, creating the greenish radioactive glass that archaeologists dig up to this day. From this moment on, the Genesis narrative takes on the contours of a forensic autopsy. The cosmic body that exploded up there didn't evaporate by magic. It was violently pulverized. It is known that these celestial objects are rich in sulfates, heavy minerals, and a massive payload of sulfur. The atmospheric detonation melted this entire volume all at once, generating a hellish cloud of burning plasma. The horrifying result is that thousands of tons of superheated rock and combusting minerals plummeted onto the plain. Think about it. When the text reports that it rained fire and brimstone, it was no metaphor. It literally, physically rained molten, smoking space material onto the heads of that astounded population. As if the thermal hell and the rain of flames weren't enough, the physical coup de grace arrived. After the blinding light and the stone-melting heat, mechanical force swept away the rest. The airburst launched a supersonic pressure wave downward, crushing the air toward the ground like an invisible hammer. A shock wave, traveling above the speed of sound, has the power to shear massive structures. The defensive walls of Tal el-Hammam, the probable historical Sodom, were up to 50 feet thick, built with millions of mud bricks. They were designed to withstand years of military siege. But against a wall of supersonic pressure attacking from the sky to the ground, these defenses were useless. The city was ground to dust. The brutal mathematics of this final impact were recorded in the ruins and foundations. Excavations reveal that the bases of the palaces didn't fall randomly. They were crushed and sliced in a rigorously directional manner. The top of the city was ripped off, shredded, and scattered across the valley in a fraction of a second. The air was violently sucked out of the region, lungs collapsed, and the entire metropolis, with all its proud kings, merchants, and riches, was wiped off the map. Judgment descended from the heavens using celestial mechanics to execute a definitive sentence. But the earth still harbored one last torment, a profound alteration that would poison that soil for centuries to come. It's fascinating to realize how science and archaeology merely confirm what the timeline of the scriptures was already shouting millennia ago. In fact, if you want to have this same clarity when reading the Word, understanding the exact sequence of each historical event without getting lost, I left a special recommendation for you. Take a look at the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order, from Genesis to Revelation, which is pinned in the first comment right below the video. It is spectacular material for those who want to see the Bible not as disjointed books, but as one great continuous historical documentary. But getting back to our autopsy, as I said, the cosmic impact was not the absolute end. The land in that region would still suffer a profound chemical alteration that would poison it for centuries. The book of Genesis makes a surgical and terrifying observation at the end of verse 25 in chapter 19. The sacred text records that, besides the cities and all the inhabitants, the destruction swept from the valley the vegetation of the land. For centuries, academia treated this line as a simple, dramatic wrap-up. a harmless literary flourish to make the end of the story darker and more poetic. But the earth, which always acts as humanity's greatest documentary witness, came forward to prove that the biblical account is not fictional poetry. It is a rigorous forensic report. When modern fronts of archaeologists and geologists began to meticulously map the soil strata corresponding to the centuries following the destruction of Tal el-Hammam, our probable historical Sodom, they stumbled upon a monumental enigma. Official science dubbed this mystery the Late Bronze Age anomaly, and the stratigraphic data revealed the following: that entire region, considered the great breadbasket of the ancient world, and which the Bible itself directly compared to the garden of the Lord, simply turned off. The timeline suffers a brutal blackout. No one planted a seed, no one harvested a fruit, no one pastured a flock, and absolutely no village was rebuilt there for a crushing period of 600 to 700 years. The most coveted plain in the Middle East became a ghost zone overnight. And here I ask you, do you really think the earth just got tired of producing? How does a valley fought over tooth and nail by kings and empires become a sterile, uninhabitable desert in a matter of hours? To understand this sudden and irreversible infertility, we need to look at the immediate geographic neighbor of the explosion, the Dead Sea. As its very name bluntly points out, it is not an ordinary body of water. It is one of the most hypersaline and chemically aggressive basins on the entire planet. Its dense waters do not support organic life. They form a thick, lethal soup of sodium chloride, magnesium, potassium, and absurd concentrations of natural sulfur. It is an environment so inhospitable that even prolonged contact with human skin causes violent reactions. And it was exactly this cauldron of toxicity that found itself in the line of fire of the detonation. When the airburst exploded in the sky, dumping a thermal hell of thousands of degrees, the supersonic pressure wave didn't just crush the solid mud palaces. This colossal and invisible force slammed head-on into the surface of the Dead Sea. The physics generated by this mechanical and thermal impact borders on the unimaginable. The pulse of extreme energy didn't just boil the sea's crust, it instantly vaporized millions of tons of that toxic water, ejecting a monumental amount of fluid out of its natural basin. The mechanics of the event were relentless. Right after the flash that melted the buildings, a colossal wall of superheated steam formed, carrying thousands of tons of coarse salt and boiling minerals. This wall wasn't a liquid wave like a traditional tidal wave. It was a true tsunami of salt and toxic steam pushed at supersonic speeds across the entire expanse of the valley. This dense, scalding, and asphyxiating cloud swept over the plain of Sodom like a coup de grace to the spine of the local ecosystem. When this chemical storm finally lost its energy and the smoke cleared, the land was irrevocably dead. Agronomic science explains exactly what happened. When you inject a sudden and massive payload of heavy salts into agricultural soil, you instantly destroy its osmotic capacity. In plain English, salt reverses the natural flow of life. Plant roots can no longer absorb water. On the contrary, the brutal excess of salinity sucks the moisture from inside the plants, killing any vegetation through fulminating cellular dehydration. The cosmic bombardment altered the pH and structure of the soil at a molecular level. State-of-the-art laboratories that analyzed the destruction matrix in recent excavations proved that the Earth has concentrations of salt and sulfates that fall outside any normal geological or climatic pattern. The anomaly is entirely artificial and was imposed from the top down. The archaeological report brings down the gavel with no room for doubt. The land was not merely torched by the fire that fell from space, it was chemically castrated. The explosion used the waters of the Dead Sea itself as a weapon of mass sterilization. That is the physical, documented, and irrefutable reason why the Jordan Valley remained a sterile graveyard for centuries. It was physically impossible to sprout a single grain of wheat in those salty ashes. If the fire and brimstone did the dirty work of demolition, it was the salt tsunami that signed the sentence of permanent annihilation. And it is precisely in the middle of this scenario of absolute heat, toxic steam, and instant sterilization that the biblical text presents us with its most tragic figure, the eyewitness who tried to defy the physics of destruction and paid the ultimate price. Chapter 19 of Genesis holds one of the verses most mocked by the critics on duty, and ironically, most misunderstood even by people of faith. Verse 26 says, "But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt." For millennia, popular imagination transformed this human tragedy into an almost childish magic trick, illustrating the event as if a divine punishment had turned her into a giant kitchen salt shaker by magic. But as we are seeing through our archaeological autopsy, there is no sorcery operating in the Jordan Valley. There is the brutal and inflexible physics of a large-scale cataclysm. And the death of Lot's wife is, in reality, the perfectly documented description of a body exposed to the edge of a supersonic shock wave. To understand the forensic mechanics of what happened to her, we need to map out the geography of the escape. The angels who pull the family out of the city are very incisive in their instructions. Flee to the mountains, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. From a scientific, military, and civil defense point of view, this is the exact instruction given to someone who needs to run out of the blast radius of a nuclear detonation. Lot and his family were fleeing on foot, exhausted, and found themselves at the extreme limit of the annihilation radius, what we call the kill zone. They needed every second, every step to get out the valley before the airburst detonated the atmosphere. In the physics of massive explosions, being on the edge of the epicenter is a race against death decided in fractions of a second. When the space rock exploded over Sodom and ejected that tsunami of toxic steam, boiling minerals, and hypersaline water, a cloud similar to a pyroclastic surge traveled across the plain, tearing through the wind and swallowing the landscape. This is where the fatal error comes in. Looking back, in the context of the stress of a desperate desert escape, means hesitating. It means stopping the run, turning the body, and losing the only seconds separating survival from death. And when you have a wall of burning ashes and salt vapor traveling at hundreds of miles per hour behind you, hitting the brakes is signing your own death warrant. What hit Lot's wife was not a folkloric spell. It was a wall of extreme physical and chemical shock. The instant she hesitated and stopped, the edge of this lethal cloud swallowed her. Physiology coldly explains what happens to the human body under these atmospheric conditions. The first impact is fulminating asphyxiation. Breathing superheated air at exorbitant temperatures and saturated with vaporized sulfur boils the natural moisture of the lungs and collapses the airways in a millisecond. The body drops instantly, then the overwhelming heat dries up any remaining biological moisture. But why is the Bible so specific in calling her a pillar of salt? Remember the physics of the explosion we dissected in the previous topic. The shock wave ejected billions of gallons of the Dead Sea into the air. The storm that swallowed Lot's wife was overloaded with an incandescent mud of sodium chloride and petrified minerals. As she hit the ground, she was immediately entombed by a thick crust of molten salt, ash, and debris launched by the impact. She didn't chemically transform into pure salt. She was mercilessly encapsulated by it. It is the exact same forensic principle that preserved the bodies of the victims of the Mount Vesuvius volcano in the city of Pompeii, who became stone casts under the ashes. The big difference is that in Sodom, the cast was created by the saline and toxic bombardment of the Dead Sea Basin. Lot's wife became an instant chemical fossil, calcifying in the desert as a witness frozen in time, proving with her own death that the laws of planetary physics do not forgive those who underestimate the weight of divine warning. The crushed and charred ruins resting silently in the Jordan Valley do not let us lie. They are the hard, cold, material proof that the biblical text was never just playing at writing dramatic poetry. The literal brimstone, the heat of thousands of degrees, and the firestorm left a chemical footprint so deeply driven into the ground that it took our cutting-edge science nearly 4 millennia to piece this forensic puzzle together completely. What happened on those plains went far beyond a simple stumble of nature. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah represents the exact intersection, the terrifying point of collision, where divine judgment operated and pulled the trigger through the most extreme and brutal mechanical force of planetary physics. Faced with such an overwhelming report, how is it possible to keep treating this account as a harmless legend? That desert vastness is not just an ancient graveyard of rich, arrogant metropolises that thought they could do whatever they wanted. It is a true archaeological crime scene, with the corpus delicti preserved under lock and key beneath thick crusts of salt and radioactive glass. It is the earth rubbing it in our faces without mincing words that absolute annihilation is not an invention to scare people. It is an undeniable historical reality, burned into the stones and into the memory of the ancient world. At the end of the day, today's microscopes merely attest to what the scriptures were already declaring. When the sky decides to settle the bill and wipe the slate clean, physics definitively does not forgive.